this weekend, man, back to the basics. I'm going to go grocery shopping. I'm going to go run. I just went on a little walk. It's really beautiful outside.
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing this last few weeks.
People are still wearing masks.
Good.
But there's a lot of people who aren't.
Not good.
I was visiting Ian, my friend, in Annapolis, and he said he went on a trip to Florida, and like no one in Florida wears masks. And now I guess they're having a resurgence, so I don't know.
It's asymmetric risk. I don't care if masks don't work or not. It's just if they don't work and you don't wear them, if they don't work and you do wear them, that's much, much better than if they do work and you don't wear them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Pascal's wager, modern form.
Yeah.
We're not going to start talking about religion. Yeah, I'm excited. I think New York's going to open up soon. But yeah, man, I've had a hard few weeks. I just feel like I was actually just listening to this podcast with Jordan Gall and Brian Castle, and Jordan was saying, he literally said this, and I was like, oh my gosh, this guy's been in my life, because he said he loves the idea of working at night and has been stuck in this routine where he does the busy work stuff in the morning and is not having time for the bigger projects. And then he in his mind imagines once he clears off the stuff, the urgent stuff, not the important stuff, but the urgent stuff, the night will come and he'll be able to just focus. But then he doesn't have any energy, at night. And he just he says, I'll do it the next day. And then the next day you spend the productive morning doing that urgent stuff. And then you don't have room for the important stuff. And I'm like, man, I've been in that cycle too. And it's so frustrating.
Dude, same. I mean, it's so bad.
It's so bad. And I think there's a lot that will help with this, which would be going back to normal and getting the office and stuff. I can't wait for that. But even my exercising habits have been off, and just, yeah. Yeah,
because before we had awesome boundaries set up, and maybe we weren't thinking about those. We weren't explicitly thinking about those, but we had an office and we were in at certain hours, and that's when work got done. And then when we're working from home, it's so easy to be yeah, I'll do this later tonight. And then you're tired. And yeah, that happens 4 nights in a row. And you're just what am I doing?
I know.
And the worst,
and it's I feel guilty.
Yeah. The worst part is you look back at the work that you did those 4 days. And like you said, it's replying to emails and meetings. And it there's literally nothing to show for it.
I know, man. It's so bad. I don't know what to do.
I like the back to basics.
Yeah, no, seriously. For me, I'm also just trying to get away from feeling guilty about stuff like this is just not useful or helpful. But I still do sometimes feel guilty. Oh, man, I really even this week I wanted this Mirage tutorial. I've been working. I started this work journal because I just wanted to keep track of what I've been working on. And I really like it because I do get to look back at the last month and see what I've done. And turns out I do work a lot. Even, I'm sitting on my computer 40, 50 hours a week. Turns out I am getting things done, which is nice. But even if it doesn't feel like it. But the most important things are still, it's easy for them to slide. And this Mirage tutorial, every week for the last 3 weeks on my work journal, I've been I worked on this. I wanted to ship it this week. This is my number one priority for next week. If this is the only thing that gets done, I'd be happy. And then it just slips and slips. And here we are again. It's Friday. And I really could ship it in half an hour if I just had focus. But it's this weird combination of energy and I don't know, it's weird. But yeah, the stuff about deadlines is really interesting. We were talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, you had a suggestion of doing deadlines. And I like that. I mean, it just forces you to actually make a trade-off. I think that's one of our biggest problems is that
I think so too.
It's very easy to say, okay, this needs more polish. It needs more work. And the deadline is the thing that controls that.
Yep. I know. I was in one of my dark moments where I was just feeling guilty about not getting stuff done. I was I just need to go back to work for someone for the next month and have someone crack the whip, But Adam was talking about some of their practices that he wants to kind of implement now that he's hiring folks for Tailwind to work on Tailwind. And he wrote this document. I think he might end up sharing it. But some of the things he was saying in there was how they work, and it had to do with these notions of deadlines and that you have a deadline and you need to get better at controlling scope. And that's we've done this already a little bit, and it's worked well when we've done it. even just shipping the tutorial as we've been going and not having like long PRs. We have the REPL live. I feel like that stuff is really good. It's like the final 10%, right? And he had this really interesting point in there, which was like, whenever we have these, he like categorizes the work into like bigger things he calls projects and like smaller things he calls something else. But the bigger things have like 2-week deadlines or 3-week deadlines, and you change the scope to fit it in the deadline. And the thing that ends it, that ships it, that completes it, is a blog post. So if you can't announce the thing with a blog post as public, it's not done.
That's great.
And I feel like that, even just that little change would have affected how we did the tutorial and the REPL, because now it feels like we have both of those things are ongoing, and that's like, it would be better probably if we just had the tutorial a month ago and hadn't started on the REPL kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just hard to balance between like wanting to work on the bigger stuff to ship it, but also wanting to like go where we're inspired to and feel like going. And there's some times where you just need to do the work, even if you don't feel like it. But I feel like sometimes I can go too far with that, and then it's like you have the situation where we have like 5 ongoing things and none of them are done. It doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of like a blog post or even a tweet that is an announcement, right? That way, like, what would that look like to have said the tutorial would take 3 weeks and it ends with an announcement? I would have spent a lot less time on like, I was doing this thing with images, dude. I like this week I worked on it, and like I have these embedded images in the tutorial, and they look so much like the code snippets that I wanted to give them a treatment. Because it was just confusing. And so I tried some different things like medium style, not like interactive, just like shadows or borders. I just went with a simple border that I liked, but then like it worked well on the white images, but then there was a dark image and I needed to change it. So I got in this rabbit hole of like Gatsby image. We were talking about that Gatsby image thing just to customize it. So I made it so that you can just, if you upload an image, if you reference it in a markdown and it ends in -dark, then it will use a dark variant, like a dark shade of the border.
Oh, cool.
It looks neat. And it's not only just that it looks neat, it helps separate it and makes it clear. So I got that working. But like that's the kind of thing that could be cut if I was on another deadline. Or I'd find I wouldn't have explored with as many different variants and stuff like that,
Hey, I just had a thought on the like writing the email, writing the tweet. Writing the blog post, writing the tweet. I was also thinking like you could do an email. It would be
email is actually really great.
It would be interesting to start at the end and write that email, write that blog post as like your very first step. And that's the way that you're like, you outline the scope. If we wrote a blog post that was like, this is a REPL, this is what it can do. It feels like, I don't know. Maybe there's.
I wonder if you're locking yourself into fixed scope and fixed deadline at that case. You overpromise and you're like, oh, it was in the blog post that we committed to, and so now I can't get it done or something.
Yeah, I was okay. I was thinking more along the lines of like, you don't let scope creep happen for those next 2 weeks because you're like, okay, I didn't write this in the blog post. I shouldn't go down this path.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because there's always things that come up that you didn't anticipate. But he writes about that too. And like Basecamp folks have talked about this too. So I think...
Is this a whole like shape up stuff?
Yeah, it's like related to that. Adam doesn't use that terminology, but I think it's a similar part of it, which is like... Yeah, part of it is what can you ship in 2 weeks? And obviously it can't be like... His example is like renderless component library for Vue. Like that is too big. Even for 4 or 6 weeks is like way too big. So... What's more realistic is like a renderless dropdown that we can do in a month, right? Mm-hmm. And you can ship that, and you don't need to wait until the whole thing's done to ship the thing. So for us, it would have been like the REPL. Yeah, we've kind of been thinking about the REPL too big, right? Because it's been useful, but it's not been live, and there hasn't been an announcement post. So what would it have looked like? I mean, I can tell you right now, it's super easy. Just like GET requests and, no database tab, like... No post requests. And like we said, we didn't want to ship it without that because it's like not complete. But again, it just would have been better. people would have been using it, we would have worked on slightly different things. So seems pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah.
Even the tutorial, you could imagine breaking it into 2 parts, or just shipping it with like, this part is not ready yet, and but it's still polished enough that people could start it,
Yeah. Well, I mean, we went through the Redwood tutorial, and they say that, and the Redwood tutorial is great.
It's fantastic. Yeah, exactly.
So it wasn't like, oh man, this sucks. Like,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Adam has shipped a screencast on Tailwind. He has like 2 of 7 parts done. The rest aren't done, but the other parts are great. People get value out of them, a ton of value out of them. So I think we should think about doing this. It's pretty interesting, and it seems like not a huge leap from what we're doing, just a few tweaks that will make, put things in the right place. So that feels pretty good.
Yeah,
but,
it's definitely not a huge leap.
Yeah. But yeah, man, this weekend, gotta buy food, gotta go for a run. Just quarantine, so bad. I do really well with rules. Is there a service you can pay someone who will just pick up the phone at you at 6 a.m. and just yell at you like a drill sergeant? That's what I need. That brings out the best in me.
Nice.
Or just like an unhealthy relationship.
Yeah. That's what I was going to recommend.
A bossy girlfriend or something like that. I guess I probably just ask my mom to call me, and yell at me. Although she's not really that type. She actually would be the opposite. We're getting really. She'd be like, oh, you deserve an extra like 30 minutes. Just hit the snooze button. You're like, no, that's not the point. I need the opposite. You're why I have no self-discipline to begin with. Oh my goodness. Cool, man. So you've been slinging some React?
Yeah. I've been doing two React projects. Actually 3. Talk about overextending. 2 of them are client work though. So,
do you think React teams should have we should have a new term for like the useEffect specialist? And it's like, there's like for every 4 React developer teams, there's like 3 who are React developers, and there's one who's like a React-useEffect developer.
Is that the ratio, 3 to 1?
I think so.
Yeah.
What you were saying? You learned something about useEffect?
Yeah. So I think I work on this app. There's a whole bunch of effects and a lot of changing components, and I think like before the last few weeks, I had always thought of useEffect as like, you should write out your effects with no dependency array, just that they always run. And then when you need to optimize them, come in, add the dependency array and optimize your effects that way. And the reason I thought this is this prevents you from using that dependency array as a way to control how your effect should run, or when your effect should run. That's really the answer. But I've since changed.
That's how the docs introduce it too.
Yeah. Yes.
And you're not supposed to be thinking about when, ever.
Yes.
Like in the same way, you're not supposed to be thinking about when this p tag is updated.
It's
HTML.
It's interesting. You want to think about when in terms of when things change, but you don't want to think of when as in life cycle, as in like when
time.
It mounts. Yeah, it's time, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've totally changed my view on this.
Okay.
So what I do now is I write an effect, and the first thing I do is I immediately add an empty dependency array.
Okay.
That is the very first thing I do. And then I have the ESLint rule for, what is it? No
exhaustive depths.
That's it. Where if you use something inside of your effect that's defined outside of the effect and inside of render, then you get an ESLint warning. As soon as I get that little yellow squiggly, I right click on it and I tell ESLint to fill in the dependencies. And I actually treat the dependency array as like the programming language. I imagine that this thing is auto-generated and I have no control over it.
Yeah.
The reason for this is that
That's great.
Yeah. And I found that this has made everything a lot easier. I ran into a bug where we had an effect that was doing something that was I'm not like idempotent. I'm not sure if that's the best term to describe this. Something like document.title, right? Where it doesn't really matter how many times this component renders. It doesn't really matter how many times the effect runs. Like if you're setting the same title and you run it 50 times or you run it once, it doesn't matter. The component's going to be right. With most of these apps that I work on, like the effects aren't that simple, right? They're making API calls, they're loading third-party JavaScript, they're doing all all these like service integrations that really people can explain, but no one really understands. And so we had an effect that was calling third-party JavaScript, and that effect was rerunning on every render. But the reality is like that thing should have only been run once. And the reason this became a problem is because this component could only ever update in one way, right? This was like a component that was really high in the tree, and it could only ever update when it received a new prop. It received one prop that could change, and that's when the effect would run, right? Because the effect would run on render. So it just so happens that this effect was only running when that prop changed, even though it wasn't explicit, because that's the only way this component could change. And then as we add new features to the app and we add more hooks to the app, this component gets a little more responsibility. And now all of a sudden it can re-render in different ways. In this case, it had a context, and that context was changing, and that caused this component to re-render. And so, yeah, I realized here, it's like, okay, so like, what was the problem? It's like, I had this effect, and this effect shouldn't have been rerunning on every render. It just so happened that it lined up that on every render was the times it should rerun, but then as soon as we introduced more ways to re-render, it was broken. It was a bug.
Isn't the counter argument that your effect was like faulty? Like your effect could have been written in a way that
absolutely. The effect didn't capture the business logic. The effect only should have run when the name prop changed. However, the only way the component could re-render is when the name prop changed. So
no, I understand that, but couldn't the purist or whatever argue like, well, the fix here is to make it so that the code inside your effect is idempotent truly, and therefore like React can decide to re-render your entire app at any time, and you wouldn't have whatever the actual bug was in this case.
100%. But the code in here was like, the code in here was like funky. There was just a lot of code in there. And, like I said,
basically, like if you were to, sorry, go ahead.
Like I said, we could all explain what the code was doing, and it looks idempotent. It looks like, oh, it's fine. It's just going to do all this stuff. But then somewhere in that chain, there's like a call to a third party. And you like, it was a little bit more than document.title, right? It was actually affecting the world, and it created this issue. So like, I think it's really hard to ask developers to like think like, okay, look at this code. Does it have real world side effects, or does it have idempotent side effects? Like that's kind of a hard question to answer. In the case of like document title versus fetch, like we can easily point at it and answer. We can say like fetch is a real world side effect. Document title is idempotent.
Right. So basically, if you were going to take the other approach, leave the dependency array off completely so it could rerun literally whenever it needed to, in order for you to make the code in the effect idempotent in that way, you would end up recreating like the dependency array. So you would do something like using a ref to track if you've run this yet, and if so, have an if block inside the effect that just doesn't run all that gnarly code.
Yeah.
So that it is safe to rerun over and over again.
Yeah. And that's a great point. So that was like one of the paths we were going to go down, and we had a discussion with the team, and it was like, look, like we didn't understand, like there was uncaptured business logic, right? We shouldn't be running this effect every time. There was business logic. We didn't, it was kind of like implicit in the fact that this component would only re-render when the prop changed, but by putting like a ref in there and using an if statement, we're actually making it explicit. we're saying when this thing should run. Yeah, that's sort of when I like landed on like, if I treat like this dependency array as like, I'm making air quotes here, but like part of the programming language. That feels like that makes it a little better. It feels like it's not forcing me to think about this effect as much. And I don't know, maybe there's like, I can't really think of a situation where like you would want it to rerun on every render. Like where an auto-generated dependency array has problems, but rerunning on every render doesn't. Because the way I think about re-renders is it doesn't really matter if your component re-renders 50 times or 2 times. It should behave the same way in both situations.
Totally. But there is a difference. Somehow we're back in this useEffect nest. What I was going to let me first say the thing I was going to say, then I'll react to that. The first thing is like, in some ways you can squint your eyes, and making an effect that has no dependencies and just runs on every render that uses an if check with a ref to keep track internally, quote internally to the effect, about whether or not this gnarly code has run yet, and avoiding rerunning it, is basically the same thing as adding the dependency array. The dependency array is kind of like a built-in declarative way to just say exactly that. And so the only question I have is like,
can I push back on this a little? So I think like I 100% agree with you. I think that a lot of times the dependency array also gets used as a control flow thing, where it's like when to run this effect and not much,
which is wrong.
Yes. But I mean,
I agree.
I think it's wrong, but I can tell you, we can open any React app and we're gonna see it.
But setting that aside, if you're using the dependency array in order to encode this thing, which is basically making it so that this effect is like safe, it's like you're trying to make the effect safe and correct so that it doesn't run when it's not supposed to.
Yep.
And the dependency array is one way to do that. And using an if statement with a ref that keeps track whether it's run or not is another way. So my only question is like, imagine a world where you have less control over your app than you do today. Concurrent mode is like re-rendering things, throwing things away. Is there a difference there where you use the dependency array to make your effect safe? And so you think as long as it only runs when this prop changes, which is like never in this app, it's only going to run once, therefore I'm good. But now, is that really what that code says? From React's perspective, what is the contract with an effect that has those dependencies? Is it that, or is it really, I can run this effect anytime, passing in the latest version of these props that are in the dependency array, and I should be able to throw this away and rerun it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you use the if statement, and that wouldn't work in your case, like the dependency array wouldn't make the effect safe to rerun, because React would say, I'm going to run it, and here's the latest version. You told me this is the effect that should run with this version, this values of the state. I'm going to run it. And actually we hit the bug because we're going to run it again. Whereas if you wrote it in a way that was truly like using the if statement, React could literally run it whenever, and it would always be safe because you're basically in control of it. So so to answer that, I don't think concurrent mode has an effect on this. But that's a great point. And this is one of the things that we talked about. It's like, if you use the if statement, it is like the most explicit version. And, right.
It's not even about that. It's more about like the developers capturing the business logic, right? Like anyone can open that effect, and you don't even have to know React. You can just be like describing the code to someone, and the business logic is perfectly captured. Where it's like, if you have things in a dependency array, then like, it's like kind of like React knowledge, right?
Right.
It's not, it's just, you know a lot about React and you know how it works. Yeah, that's a good question. I should definitely look into that and be aware of that. I think to like boil down what you said, it's like just because you have something in a dependency array means it will rerun whenever those values change. But there's a question where if those values
doesn't
don't
mean
change,
it won't run.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
If those values don't change, is the system allowed to rerun it?
Exactly. That's a great question to ask someone who knows the answer to it. Because if the whole, it's kind of interesting too, right?
It's super interesting because I'm basically making the argument that like, you should let the program, I say programming language because I consider this ESLint rule as part of your React programming mental model. I'm saying that you should let the programming language, auto decide what everything you're using is, and then have it automatically rerun when those things change. But that just might not be true. I might need to like more explicitly capture these rules.
Right. Interesting. So we're in agreement that the if statement is more explicit, and you could actually also layer the if statement on top of the effect that uses the deps. So if you imagine a world where the deps weren't even an argument.
Hey, in my case, I would have to do that because, like I said, I make that empty array, and then I just say, do your thing, React compiler, autocomplete these. Yes,
totally. So it's almost like you want if the second argument wasn't even there, and React automatically did the deps thing, you would still need to use the if statement in certain situations to make sure the thing doesn't rerun.
Yep.
It's really just that the deps thing is helping you. The deps thing is there to help you consider the cases where the props change and you haven't done anything about it. Whereas the if statement, or like really what you're doing is like memoization, right? In some sense, like if the CK editor instance already exists, I don't need to reinstantiate this. But maybe if the prop changes, I need to reset the text value on the editor. Or if the script hasn't been loaded from the third party, I need to load it. Otherwise, I might need to do other things if these props change. Yeah. So it almost feels like they're, on the one hand, you're trying to consider what to do if the props change. On the other, you're trying to make your effect safe to re-renders.
Yeah, I would say the first, like the reason for this discussion is that you might think your component can only re-render in one way, and you might completely understand how your entire system works, how your components receive props. But then someone comes along and adds a new prop or a new hook that now causes it to re-render in other ways.
And it can be a completely unrelated part of the app.
It can be, you could be using a context and that context never changes until someone else starts using it and starts changing it. So there's a million ways that this can happen. And it's to really, to force you to capture like when this effect should run. So that when this component does change and does start re-rendering 50 times, you're safe from that. And I guess maybe like after having this, maybe both, maybe like auto-completing the dependency array as well as
I know, but we're back to this conversation that we had like 2 or 3 episodes ago where I don't know if you can have both. You can either optimize for one world where you are catching bugs related to stale state that you didn't consider before, or you're optimizing for another world, which is safety. And that is that I don't make a loop of fetch calls or re-download a third-party JavaScript 9 times because my component happened to re-render. If you optimize for the safety case, you use the if statement, but then you might miss out on dep changes that are actually important. If you optimize for the thing where the programming model is going to let you know if dep changes have happened that you haven't considered, then you have exposed yourself to the risk of the thing running not due to a dep change, but due to a re-render. So
we should get that. We should get the question answered that can in effect run if no deps have changed. And I like my gut reaction there is no, it can't. Like this is a guarantee, but we should actually get a clear answer.
And also just like what should your mental model be like? When you're writing an effect, should you be thinking I'm going to write this like, Ryan Florence says to synchronize this with this piece of state, or am I writing this to be safe and making sure? Is my primary goal to make sure that this syncs with every state it depends on, or is my primary goal to write this effect in a way it's truly idempotent and safe? Because when I compose my application of idempotent effects, React can do more of the work. I can offload more of my code to the system. And as long as I just laser focus on making this thing like my fetch call, like it's idempotent, like it can run as many times as I want. And I've done the hard work of using memoization to say, if this thing exists in ref or in context, I don't need to rerun this. But as far as the effect is concerned, you can rerun that thing all you want. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It kind of feels like a slightly different mental model. I mean, there's overlap here, obviously, which is why it's so confusing, but it feels like it's a different mental model, like how you should think about it. But also, like, the fact that you've been working on all these apps and, like, you can't, that's your boots on the ground experience there, which is like, this is way better to do it like this. And so that's huge.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, sure, there might be like a million caveats here, but without a doubt, like auto-completing that dependency array. And I mean, here, step one is don't use the dependency array for control flow. And that's the thing that, like, listen, like, I'm guilty of it. Everyone's guilty of it. But that's the first thing to fix.
Yeah. And I'm 100%. That seems like unequivocal for sure. The right way based on our experience, our understanding, the Twitter conversations and the docs, all that's not what it's there for.
And then I think my second thing was like, okay, don't use a dependency array where you don't need it. But then that raises the question of like, is my effect idempotent? So is it like making a call to change document.title, or is it like calling into some analytics service? And that question, unfortunately, isn't always easy to answer because like it's very rare that we have effects that are just document.title or like analytics service.update.
Right.
So yeah. My current thinking here is autocomplete. Like pretend that you don't control that array. Pretend it's part of the programming language. And yeah.
Interesting. No, I mean, it's true that you can't always, the practical, like compromise answer here. I was working on that auth stuff a few weeks ago. I need to get back to that actually, but, setting up Firebase, in an effect, which is what you do. It's how you do it. You import Firebase and create your new app, and you do it in a hook or whatever. And, you can't make it idempotent because you instantiate the Firebase app, and with a config that you pass in, and you like can't destroy it, I think, or the cleanup was async. So you cannot make it idempotent, because you can't have two instances of the Firebase app on the page at the same time. And if you make an effect that checks if it already exists and creates it if it doesn't, but if it does, it ignores it, then if you change your config and the hot module reloading happens, right? In a production app, you're never going to have this happen, but this is a local, but it's still the same idea. The hot module reloading occurs, it reruns your effect, which in a perfect world is idempotent and can be rerun, or like synchronized with the new state, which is your new config. But yeah, if the thing exists, then it ignores it. If it doesn't exist, it creates it, but there's no way to update the config. And if you wanted to make it idempotent, the way you'd do it is you'd have to delete the app, the Firebase app, and then reinstantiate it. But it's async, and there's no way to do that, basically. There's no way to do that.
Could you have like your tear down, call the async thing, and then set some state? And
then your setup would have to check, like do a loop and check that,
or
until it knew it was destroyed, and then it could actually create a new Firebase app with that. But like your app is expecting there to be a Firebase app, so like it's just like not like a new state.
You're exactly There's like that new in between state. I mean, this is like I always go back to this. This is like the purest like you've identified some new state of your app that is possible with hot module reloading that you didn't know about before. And this is forcing you to deal with it. Yeah.
But the reality is, like, there's a lot of situations you could be in as a developer where this kind of thing is not, there is no, like, .update method to, like, update the config. And there is, like, really no way to write this effect in a idempotent way that is not going to be so costly as to not at all be worth it.
Yeah, I mean, the worth it is definitely
The
a question you have to ask and answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, just, hearing this, I would say, like, yeah, set some state when the async thing gets destroyed, and then that state is going to force another re-render, and then the main effect is going to say, like, if is fully destroyed, then I can set this thing up.
It's almost like you want to wait a hook into the hot module reloading and say it's not ready yet. Like, there's been a hot module reloading. Okay, run our cleanups. Now wait, and now we're ready for the new modules.
Yeah.
Because, like, you're accounting for a new state that only exists because of a development feature. You know? It doesn't seem good to add application code to deal with that, right? But you could do it transparently without application code. If there was a way to hook into the hot module reloading.
I know, it's like, you don't want to deal with this thing because it's only in dev, but it is a state in dev.
Yeah, but it's not like you don't deal with like half compiled code. Your application code doesn't. You wait for your dev server to like do all that stuff. So there's like a million in between states, but from the perspective of your app, you don't write application code to deal with those. There's a boundary there. It feels like there's a boundary.
You're saying there's okay, I get what you're saying. So I wasn't understanding. So you should be able to hook into like hot module reloading itself to define cleanup and setup, and then there's like a lag in between every hot module reload where you run those things.
Exactly. Like, I wouldn't be terribly upset about adding a cleanup function that calls like app.destroy, but if it's async, the hot module reloading waits and before jumping back in again.
Yeah, that feels right. It feels like it's like the right boundary. Like we wouldn't want to add like test code to our app.
Yeah.
We put it at some like testing setup, tear down boundary.
Exactly. Anyways, pretty interesting topic though. I do feel like I want to make a video of this. I have it in my backlog, but React is a programming language for UIs because it does feel like that's the right way to think about it.
It is. That's 100% true.
Yeah. And this is another good point. Like the dependency array thing should just be a given. It should just be a given, basically, like you were saying. So I like that rule. And you actually kind of convinced me, because at the beginning when you said that, I was like, no, definitely not. It should just be undone. Like, it should have no dependency array. That's how it's meant to be used and thought about. But if you're going to be doing no dependency array with the if statement, then why not? Yeah, you're already there, basically.
Yeah. We should. I want to figure out a way to ask that question where if it can rerun even if it doesn't change. Because that would. Yeah. I'll be back in 3 months with Ryan's latest hot take on how to use Effect.
Moving on. I made a YouTube video last week about React Router. That was pretty fun. Cool to see React take on routing, Yeah, programming language, low level primitives, but pretty neat. It's like, when we first made Mirage and we made our own router, like, that's basically what I did again. But like, you can do, if we were to do that today with React Router v6, like, we would write a lot less code because of the primitives that they're exposing now.
Nice.
Which is pretty neat.
I think one of the reasons we made our own router is because all of our pages were keyed. So that when you navigate from page A to page B, if you have a overflow div that was scrolled, because the thing was keyed, the page is completely teared down. So even if that div exists on both pages, that state was lost.
Yeah, that is why we initially wanted to go with fully client-side routing, and why we basically backed out of like the default Gatsby router. And so we just used Reach Router directly, and we render like one route, and our app is bundled completely at that route, right?
I think we still use the routes. We just don't. We like render our own router because the way the router was built, it was like hidden from us, and it. Yeah.
We use Reach Router, which is bundled in it, but we don't use any of the pages. The way Gatsby works is like you create a page file, and then it automatically creates a route for you, and we just do all that ourselves.
Yeah. We use one page, and then all of our routes
and
are still routes.
And that keeps the sidebar mounted even across page transitions.
Yep.
because we can use nested routing. So like, but we still, even in spite of us using reach router and using its feature of nested routing, we still wrote our own router class, which like acts as a wrapper and did some other coordination to let us do things like render a route, a link to like /docs and have it automatically transform into like a link to /doc /getting started to traverse our hierarchy and find the first child leaf node of the hierarchy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And because reach router doesn't have that notion. And there were some other things that it didn't have notion of that we added. Active page and some different things like that. But in React Router v6, they have some new stuff that's pretty interesting. But
cool.
That addresses some of that. So like one of the problems we ran into with Reach Router was like, yeah, if you have your route hierarchy and you have a link that goes to a certain route, and you want that link to know if it's active or not, you actually can't do it if you're just looking at the link in the toprop alone, where you think you might be able to, but you can't. And we ran into this. So let's say you have 3 routes, page A, page B, page C. You would expect, okay, if I have a link to page B, I can just see if it's active, right? By looking at the URL. And if the URL matches page B, then I know it's active. And so I can make like a renderless version of a link to and yield an active state. And then I can write like nav links that are correct. But the problem is there's not always enough information in the URL to know if that link is active or not. So if you have like those 3 static links, there is. But what if you have a link mounted at the root? So what if page A is mounted at the root? So how do you know if page A is active or not without knowing that the entire route hierarchy is / for the one, / page B for the second, / page C for the third? You can't just look at a link that says to / and see if it's active. How would you do it? You could say if it's active if it's an exact match. So only if the URL is exactly /.
I see what you're saying.
But what about if there's a child route or a dynamic route? So actually, like what makes a route active has to do with what other routes are defined in your router. And this is like how Ember's router works, and this is how React Router and Reach Router work in terms of what they render to you, right? The router takes an entire hierarchy because it has to rank the relative URLs against each other. And so it can know if like /items /123 is a higher ranking than like /not found or something like that, even though not found technically matches everything because it's like a star.
That's interesting, but when you're talking about active, it's no longer a ranking. It's no longer pick the best one. It's a question of, is this active or not?
But it needs to be the best one. It needs to be tied back to the hierarchy. Otherwise, you don't know if it's active. So like, if you think about it, when you're trying to see if you want the dashboard link in the header to be active or not, you don't care about the URL and what the toprop is. You care about if the dashboard is being rendered, and the rules by which React Router or Reach Router is using to determine that should be the same rules you use to determine whether the link is active or not. So you want those two things to align. So you cannot just determine whether a link should be active or not just by looking at its toprop and the location of the document of the URL. You have to also know the entire routing hierarchy so that you can rank it in the same way that the router ranks to determine which component to render.
If you take something...
Does that make sense?
It does. If you take something like the 404 page, like the 404 page is not rendered whenever you have something else rendered because it's the lowest priority. But because the 404 page is like, its path is star.
It matches every URL.
So it's not rendered, but it's also not active, right? Because it's not...
Correct.
But I would think...
Well, it would be active. If you have 2 routes, one's a 404 page that matches everything. The other one is /introduction. Mm-hmm. Then when you're on /introduction, the 404 page doesn't match and doesn't render. But if you're on anything else, it should match and it should render. So it would be active. So if you had a link to... If you had a link to anything else that wasn't introduction, it should what you conceptually want to know is if the 2 is like, if the thing that's in 2, which component it matches against in the routing hierarchy.
It's almost like when you're rendering a link, just render the app and tell me which of those components are active. And that's how I know if a link is active.
Exactly. So what you end up wanting is some unique identifier back to the hierarchy, which in Ember is the name of the route. So that's why routes have names in Ember, where you can say dashboard.index, and that is a unique identifier. It's a key to a specific active path through your component hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. And really you want to tie links back to that name, which is why in Ember you can just do link to dashboard.index, and then it's just active if that path through the hierarchy is active. But in React Router and Reach Router up until now, there's been no easy way to do that. And so you run into all these issues. I've done this like 3 or 4 times now, basically every site I do, because like, yeah, the dashboard link, which is the home page, is like active when it shouldn't be active. And I need to like code in some weird like exact prop or like use some weird matching regex logic to make sure it stays active if its child pages are active, because like I really only need to match the starts with part. Like you shouldn't have to do anything of that. Yep. You just conceptually, you want to tie the link's active state back to the components that are being rendered by the router. So in React Router v6, there's a cool way to do that. They give you like a like a match routes function that takes in the whole hierarchy of routes and returns the ones or all of them that match. So we have this in our router, and if you look in Mirage site, we wrote this at the beginning because we ran into exactly this problem where you want to say, what is the active path? And when I'm linking to something, I want my link to somehow correspond to the active path, so now, I know if it's active or not.
And so now when you have a route that's mounted at like literally at slash, it's easy to tell because you can just look at this route tree and see if you're part of like the active path through the tree.
Exactly. I mean, it's like you can have n arbitrary routes mounted at slash, right? You could have dashboard. Dashboard could have 3 children. It could have like index, sales, and new users. Index, or like overview could be mounted at index. Overview could have children. So you could be at slash and you could be at dashboard.overview. Sales, or you could be at dashboard.overview.new users, and only the first 2 should be active.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay. So now, you really do need that path.
Exactly.
And you get it. So you get it now.
And you kind of get it. You get an array, a flat array of matches of each literal object in your route hierarchy that you've defined now in a JavaScript object instead of in a template. But you can use that to figure out the path, basically.
So in that case, you would get like dashboard/overview, and whatever the third one you mentioned was.
Exactly. But they don't have a name property. It's whatever you want it to be. So by default, they only have a path property and maybe a children array of child routes. So you can either use that to map it back, or you can give things a name property. So ideally, like there would be a name property that would make it easy to wire all this up. I was able to figure that out because I had the experience and I understood what I needed here was a way to like tie back my link to like a particular node in my hierarchy. And that way I could determine if it was active or not.
Huh.
So pretty interesting, but it's pretty cool because basically you start by rendering the router in your JSX, and within router, you are rendering routes that have a path property. And that's what React Router uses to determine what's active. But once you need that in your link to share it, you basically hoist the route hierarchy out of your JSX into a JavaScript array. Then you can use this match routes thing. And then you also get to use this match routes thing where your old router was rendered in the outlet, like the main outlet area. You pass in the JavaScript array and it returns an element, a JSX element, which is like the best match given the URL. So you pass in like the current location and the routes array, and then you just get a JSX element, which you render instead of rendering your entire router hierarchy. And that changes as the location changes.
So it's like a true outlet then.
It's a true outlet. And now they actually have an outlet component that you can render in children to render the child routes as they become active or not. But the element is basically like, instead of rendering this whole router hierarchy, we're going to return which component is active based on your route hierarchy that you passed in and the location you passed in. You can render it.
Where do you define the routes? Is it still the same, like component land?
So no, but that's what I'm saying. You start by doing it in component land, but because I wanted to make a link that shared that knowledge, I wanted to have it in a shared place. So you pull it out of component land, you pull it out of the JSX, you put it in a raw JavaScript array. I literally just put it in the same file, like above the component. And then where I used to render that in component land, now I just have a function called like, it's like match routes or it's like get best element. It's like get best, component given this hierarchy and this location, the current location from like use location hook, which updates over time. And then so as that changes, the best element you get changes, but you just throw that best element in some JSX in your template, and then that's what updates your app.
Cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. And then you can write like a nav link component that also uses that hierarchy that's in JavaScript, but uses it in a way to not to render the element, but to return the match so that you can tie it back to the link and see if it's active or not.
Very cool.
Yeah. So yeah.
I have one question about this that's totally off topic, but I think one of the other things that tripped us up with the React routing was that in order to redirect, you have to render. Have you just found any solutions to that?
I haven't yet, but I wanted to tackle that. I still think they have like a redirect thing that you have to render, but I wanted to make it so like, I still think it's dumb that like, if you render a link that's not to a node, a leaf node, you can get into like a impossible state in your app, like a thing that doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So I think what you could do is, if someone renders a link to /docs, I could throw that path into my hierarchy with the match routes and pick the one that is the leaf of, let's say, four routes match back. I need to be able to find the leaf one and then use that path instead, swap that in. And I think that would protect you from that problem. So that would get you the Ember router default behavior of being able to link to anywhere in your tree and have it automatically render synchronously to the leaf in one shot. So that would solve that problem. Then as far as redirects go, if you were to link somewhere and you wanted to add a redirect, well, if you had the whole hierarchy, you should be able to now without having to render, because now your router hierarchy is statically known if you're not using dynamic routes. And this is actually kind of cool, right? Because even though this is how like 99% of applications probably work, it's kind of cool that you can do all this because you can also do dynamic routing. So like you could have something at runtime like change the routes in this hierarchy and your app would still work, right? But you might need to render. You can imagine a situation where you have to render, like you fetch data from the server at runtime to know what the routes are.
Oh, when you said dynamic routing, I thought you were saying like post/1.
No,
but
I know.
You're saying like it might not be called posts.
Itself.
It might be called like articles, or it might be in another language, something like that.
Exactly. So like literally the hierarchy itself could change. And so what would once be like a 404 page that could potentially redirect to the home page, maybe after you make a network request, it's not anymore. So it's pretty cool that you can do that, because in a lot of the other frameworks you can't. At the same time, like the way 99% of us route, it would be nice to probably have more conventions with like the name property and stuff, but you can learn this stuff and I think it's not too bad. It's pretty cool though that you can do dynamic, like truly dynamic routing in that sense.
Yeah.
You could imagine like a file tree, like GitHub wanting to create those routes. And I think it would be a lot easier. I think what you'd end up with is much more clear code than like a /dynamic segment, because like we could have a file tree with like n depth of files and folders, right?
Yeah, I would just tell you I would have like star path, and then I would be like splitting by / and doing my own half-baked routing somewhere else and like cite some like random component, and it would be awful.
Exactly. So here maybe instead you fetch a repository, and then that repository comes back and you start like pushing routes to the router somehow, and then the best match is like updating and the links are working and everything. So that'd be a fun exercise actually. That would make a pretty cool video.
Is there one of my thoughts here? It's like, does this make like the whole static site generation? Can this play into that at all? Because like a lot of time with static sites, we want to know.
Yeah. Well, I think again, like, and where I did my video, it's like most of the time you know your routes ahead of time. Like, so yeah, if you needed to generate your whole site statically, you would need to know all the routes ahead of time. But back to your original question, I think if you were in that situation where you had a fixed like JavaScript array of your routes, you should be able to redirect without having to render, because I can tell you at build time, whatever, I can just tell you by looking at your source code, if you ever link to this thing, and you need to redirect, then we can just set that up ahead of time. Now, if you needed to redirect at runtime, let's say you visited /product/ID1234 and it's not found, and you wanted to redirect after you make like a network request, then you're back to the situation where you need to render and then redirect. But like, that's not the problem that you and I were running into. We were running into like a static case where we wanted to redirect from like doc's intro to like doc's introduction, and you should be able to do that without rendering for sure.
I mean, I do like the idea of like just eliminating this whole thing at the link to, and just saying like, you know, before we even talk about like rendering /docs, and let's just say any link that goes to /docs, we'll just rewrite it as a link to /docs/introduction.
Exactly. I think if we were starting a new app today, then I think this is how we would do it. We would just define our route hierarchy in JavaScript array, and render the outlet using like use best match or whatever, and then start writing our nav link component ourselves, also using the routes so that they can be smart. And it's pretty cool. Nice. Yeah, pretty neat.
Very nice.
There's like a lot of other cool little tricks too. Dude, they have relative routing. And it works like with dynamic segments and everything. It's really cool. So you can say like to, and then you do a relative route where you do like just like to, colon username, and you're within like the user's route, parent route. And then you have like a dynamic, let's just say a master detail list where like you're in users, and then each thing is like a dynamic segment where it's like user ID. So you just say to user ID, and then it just does it relative to the current thing. And so you can move that entire part of the tree anywhere, and all those routes still work. And the active segment works because they have this thing called use resolved location, which is a hook that takes in like a relative, any kind of to prop, either relative or absolute, and returns the full absolute name, which you can then match against the best match from the hierarchy to determine if the link is active. So in my YouTube video, I am basically refining the nav link in all these situations, and it ends up being really cool because it's like super robust to all these cool features.
Huh.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Nice.
Yeah. Kind of fun. It's different. I think I want to make that, it goes back to this video I want to make about React being a programming language for UIs, because it's the kind of thing that's like fun to play around with, but if you're building an app can be frustrating, and I think is probably a source of a lot of frustration in React, where you're like, I just want to do this easy thing, and why does it feel like React makes the easy things hard? That's kind of what it feels like sometimes. I just want to save this form when I click a button, and like now I have to learn about useEffect and idempotency and algebraic effects, and you know what I'm saying? It's like, but if you think about React as like a programming language, it's different. And so it feels like that's the better way to do it. And it might mean it's not the best tool for the job you're doing, but I do think it's the right way to think about it. And so if you're going to add routing, you should expect that you're going to be using a library like React Router v6 that gives you these low-level primitives, and you're going to be expected to learn how to use them to build the things you need for your app, as opposed to it giving you something like Ember's Router, which is like has 90% of the use cases given to you up front, you know?
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting. I definitely get the React as a programming language, but then when you say, React Router is a programming language, is that what you're also going?
I'm saying that the ethos from React spills into the ecosystem, and the ethos of React is that we're closer to a programming language than we are a application framework. Therefore, you're going to be expected to learn how to use the primitives like useState and useEffect to build your own primitives to build your app. And libraries that are popular in the ecosystem like React Router are going to adopt that philosophy, and they're going to say, we're not going to give you a high-level router. We're going to give you low-level things that are going to feel like they came from React itself. And so use location hook and a use match hook that takes in a hierarchy of things that you can use to build your own nav link. Whereas I think a Vue router or an Ember router would never do that.
Would say like link to.
Yeah, exactly. Or Rails.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
So, and I just, it's the same with our experience with Spring animation, React Spring. Like, it's crazy. Like, it felt crazy when we wanted to add a little bit of animation to a dropdown. It was crazy, right? And the way it interacts with useEffect and everything, it was really hard. But I think if we were thinking about it like, this is like a primitive that we need to understand instead of like, how fast can I get this in here? Because we've had that experience with like Ember add-ons where it's amazing. You just install an add-on, you get to use like a power drop down or a power select or something, and it just is like takes 2 props and it like is integrated, and when it works great. And it's a proper abstraction. I didn't have to learn about how it works. If we go into something like React Spring or React Router thinking that way, we're going to be frustrated and disappointed.
Right. Dude, I just side comment. I've switched all my React Spring code to Framer Motion, and just, oh my God, like
it's awesome. I want to do that. I've been wanting to do that. I was trying to do this one thing with it, and I spent like a couple hours and I couldn't get it working. And he hasn't launched the new version of Framer Motion yet, and it doesn't have like complete docs, and he's like changing some things. So I just said I'm going to come back to it in like a month or two. That's good. That's good to hear, though.
React Spring is awesome when you want to understand. I mean, you really understand everything. Like you spend a week writing a component with React Spring, and all of a sudden you have a computer science PhD. It's like it just appears
3D graphics.
It just appears on your wall. And I'm really thankful. Like I'm actually really happy that we went from like Ember animated to React Spring, because it was like really high level, and that introduced the concepts like sprites and transitions and all that. And then going to Spring was just like, okay, now you kind of realize like all the stuff that animated was doing under the hood for you. But also let you kind of like build up, okay, how would I build this up? And then going to Framer Motion is like, okay, now I'm in my happy place.
Nice. Yeah, and I definitely think like React libraries can be higher level. I just think that you're going to run across more low level ones than you might in other communities, and that is both like there's trade-offs. There is like both a good thing and a bad thing, but it's just a good thing to be aware of, you know.
Yep.
The Framer Motion thing, I still don't think it has a good solution for like just an accordion, like a thing that is like actually pushing the content down the way Ember Animated does, basically like animated if. I think you end up recreating that yourself. It can't animate like height 0 to auto. It doesn't have like a good way to do that. So that's always like the first thing that I reach for, and it's like the hardest thing to do, because I think Framer Motion took a stance that like we don't animate things that aren't performant.
Okay.
So we only animate transform and opacity basically. And so if you want to make an accordion with transform, you need to do a lot of extra work to like make room for things.
Okay, I haven't done an accordion. I've only done page transitions,
drop down or something.
Page transitions and modals. But it's been, it's been. I guess the two things. It's been once I get the component wired up, it's been easy, and then also there's like I found the examples to be really helpful.
Nice.
So, yeah, I've had a good experience with it.
That's cool. I need to give it another shot. Cool, man. Well, we're already at over an hour, so look at that. You think you have nothing to talk about? You say the word useEffect,
boom.
And where does the time go? All right, here is to a healthy weekend, one step at a time. You know, every day we get a new beginning. That's what I was thinking about as I was just walking around my neighborhood thinking of how much I failed this week. I was like, you know what? At least I don't have like a giant beer belly. Even though I ate a bag of candy yesterday, literally a bag of candy. What is wrong with me? I don't have a giant beer belly yet. I'm a little fluffier than I was a month or two ago, but we get a new beginning. We get to start the day saying, let's own it today. Let's tackle it, and just stick to the basics. That's going to be my thing here for the next week. So I'm going to try to go grocery shopping tomorrow, go for a jog. It is so beautiful outside. 82 degrees. Wow, look at that. Sun's out.
Nice.
Can't complain.
Nice.
So
we'll check in next week to see if you made it grocery shopping.
Awesome. That would be great. That's a good accountability right there. I think that is one of my keystone habits. If I actually manage, I've spent so much money on Seamless in the last 2 weeks. If I manage to shop and cook, then a lot of other good things fall out of that because there's like some discipline involved in that,
Yeah.
So that's what I'm going to go for. All right. Well, we hope you're staying safe and sane. Thank you so much for listening this week. What are we going to talk about next week? Let's sow some seeds here. Maybe Amplify.
Yeah. I've been using Amplify a lot, and it's great. So
I want to hear more about it.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, everyone. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.
See ya.